right. Hello, my name is Josh Zucker. My presentation is The Hole Through Which the English Entered France, the Assassination of John the Fearless. So, again, my name is Josh Zucker. My show is Grand Dukes of the West, a history of Valois Burgundy. If you've never listened to Grand Dukes of the West, it is unsurprisingly about the Dukes of Burgundy. This cadet branch of the French royal house ruled Burgundy and large parts of modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands in the 13 and 1400s. So this area right around here, they basically gobbled all of that up. The Dukes of Burgundy were the lords of some of Western Europe's richest areas, and their powers rivaled that of kings. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the assassination of John the Fearless, the second of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, by the Dauphin, or Crown Prince of France. Let's set the stage, though, going forward a bit to Francis I of France. The great Renaissance king was touring the Duchy of Burgundy early in his reign. By this point, the male line of the Valois Dukes of Burgundy had ended, and Burgundy was once more a possession of the crown of France. Francis was visiting the Charterhouse of Champmol, the great tomb of the dukes, and while he was there, one of the monks brought out the skull of John the Fearless, and pointing to a hole made by a Dauphin's sword, said, "This is the hole through which the English entered France." Now, I personally love this story, and despite the fact that the English kings had held land in France for hundreds of years before John the Fearless's assassination, it does bear some truth. The murder of John the Fearless by the heir to the throne of France provoked a deep rift between the future King Charles VII and the House of Burgundy, one which benefited the English mightily. But before we get to all that, we need to go back about 20 years to really see how things started. I won't go into too much depth here on the background, as my time is a bit limited, but if you want to hear more, I hear there's a really good podcast on the subject. Self-promotion aside, let's get started with the reign of King Charles VI of France. Charles came to the throne at a young age, and so his reign began with a regency council headed by his uncles. And the most powerful of these was Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Philip the Bold was able to use his position on the regency council to build up his power and lands. He managed to use the royal army to put down a major rebellion in Flanders and to force a peace between the duchies of Brabant and Gelders a few years later. Flanders was ruled by Philip's father-in-law, and as he had no sons, Philip was set to inherit. The Duke of Burgundy also had plans to secure Brabant for himself when its childless duchess died. And Brabant is right in this area, if you were curious, and then this is Flanders. But Philip didn't only use the royal army to further his goals. He also used the royal treasury. Royal gifts tended to make up about a quarter of Philip's revenues year to year, and in his most voracious years, they could rise to about half of his income, which translated to somewhere between a sixth and an eighth of the Kingdom of France's total revenues. But the good times wouldn't last forever, as Charles VI grew up and dismissed his uncles. For the next few years, he ruled well with the help of his advisors and his younger brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans. However, just 4 years after Charles began his personal rule, it was cut short by mental illness. On a trip to Brittany, the king found himself surrounded by enemies and began attacking. But he was not swinging at rebels and traitors. He was killing his own servants. After more than a little slaughter, the king tired and was overpowered. Philip the Bold and the other uncles were able to use Charles's incapacitation to take charge. The king's counselors were ousted, and the Duke of Burgundy took up his old place at the head of the royal council once more. For the rest of his life, Charles alternated between states of sanity and madness, and as he grew older, the madness took over more and more. Even when sane, the king's memory was foggy, and he was easily influenced. So while King Charles VI will live on throughout all the coming action that I will mention, he tends to fade into the background as other men, and sometimes women, will take over the running of the kingdom. This power vacuum is the major cause of the coming conflict. Over the next few years, Philip maintained his control of France, But as Louis grew up, his power grew as well, and in the early 1400s, the two were truly rivals. Every issue brought to the royal council became a battlefield, and on a few occasions, the other magnates of France decided to bar Burgundy and Orleans from meetings of the council because their bickering prevented any real business from getting done. This dynamic came to an end in 1404 when Philip the Bold died. His son, John the Fearless, became the Duke of Burgundy, but John did not have the same political connections that his father did, and within a year, Louis of Orleans monopolized the royal council. John found himself and the Burgundian party that Philip had built marginalized and excluded from the main channels of power. Therefore, the Duke of Burgundy decided to turn to popular politics. John the Fearless became a champion for reform, which made him popular with the common people of France, and that was matched by Louis of Orleans' own unpopularity. With the king often incapacitated and the Burgundians out of power, the Duke of Orleans was the one pulling the strings of the government. He was blamed for the high taxes and the wasteful spending, and he was seen as immature and frivolous. These accusations had some basis in truth, but they were magnified by John the Fearless's Burgundian propaganda machine. However, popularity only counted for so much in the French court. As the only brother of the king, Louis simply held a higher position in the feudal hierarchy than John did. The Duke of Burgundy found himself outflanked time and time again, and so, in 1407, he decided to have Orleans assassinated. The murder of the Duke of Orleans changed everything. It was the scandal of the century and sparked years of civil war. But initially, the rest of the French court was slow to react and punished the Duke of Burgundy. In fact, after a brief period of self-imposed exile, John was able to take control of the royal government. The other magnates of France were pushed aside or ignored as the Duke of Burgundy and his men took the reins of government. It wasn't until early 1409, over a year after Louis's murder, that the opposition to John the Fearless's rule solidified, and many magnates of France formed the League of Giots. John, Duke of Berry, Charles, Duke of Orleans, and many other magnates all came together to plan a military expedition to drive John the Fearless out of power and prosecute him for the death of Louis of Orleans. John had now dug himself into a bit of a hole. He could not give up power and risk the supporters of the Duke of Burgundy gaining influence over the king. To protect himself from prosecution, he needed to remain in control of the royal government, and in doing this, he alienated many other ambitious men in Paris. From there, the civil war really got going, but the parties had not yet solidified. The members of the League of Giots, which soon morphed into the Armagnac faction, were motivated by different things, and so were the Burgundians. On one hand, Charles of Orleans and many of his father's old allies and clients were motivated primarily for a desire for revenge and to avenge Louis of Orleans and punish his murder. While on the other hand, men such as the Duke of Berry aimed to reassert their role in the French government. The Burgundians tended to be more unified behind the leadership of John the Fearless, but there were still moderates that urged peace with the Armagnacs. So as the war went on several occasions, Berry and the other moderate Armagnacs made peace with the Burgundians, while the hardcore old Orleanists ended up dragged along. Well, a similar situation played out on the other side. Sorry, my dogs have sensed a neighbor coming in. Well, a similar situation... Lola! Well, a similar situation played out on the other side. But these peaces didn't last, as the more hardcore members of each faction refused to adhere to their terms. However, in the first years of the war, the hardcore members of both factions made up a fairly small portion of French subjects. Partisanship had taken hold in France back when Philip the Bold and Louis of Orleans began feuding on the royal council. But this mostly took the form of individual links of patronage rather than something resembling the party system we have today. Most of the French political class had aligned themselves with one or the other, but since the factions were based more on personal relationships, it meant that side switching was fairly common. When John the Fearless was ascendant, Many nobles and royal officers sought his patronage, only to abandon it when the Armagnacs took charge. The most notable example of this was Louis II, Duke of Anjou. Louis had agreed to marry his son John, Louis to John's daughter Catherine in 1410. But when John lost influence in Paris in 1413, Louis canceled the betrothal and returned Catherine to John. John the Fearless was enraged by this act. Not only did it mark the breaking of a useful relationship with a powerful duke, but it was also personally humiliating to both him and his daughter. And by 1413, the sides were really beginning to calcify. This was sped along by the Cabochia uprising. This uprising occurred shortly after one of those peaces arranged by the moderates, but there was still plenty of discontent in France. The Cabochia rebels were mostly lower and middle-class urban workers and were spurred on by an urge to reform the government. They were animated by John's propaganda and saw him as an ally. During this brief period of upheaval, rumors of a coming Armagnac attack on Paris were rampant, and any Armagnacs found in Paris were arrested, with a handful being lynched in the streets. When the Cabochia uprising was put down, John the Fearless fled Paris, and the Armagnacs returned. The capital and the king, and by extension royal authority, were now in the hands of the Armagnacs. They now attempted to use the royal government to persecute John the Fearless and his Burgundian partisans, just as the Duke of Burgundy had done to them when he was in power. But after about a year of this, the Dauphin, Louis of Guyenne, took power from the Armagnacs. Louis of Guyenne is quite the interesting figure and is someone who I've really come to respect throughout the course of my research. In 1415, this 19-year-old Prince of France managed to reassert royal authority in its own right and forced a détente onto the Armagnacs and Burgundians. He might have been able to establish a permanent peace if it wasn't for the twin disasters of the Battle of Agincourt and Louis's own death at the end of 1415. For this 1 year, the crown acted on its own behalf, but it wasn't to be for long. From there, the Count of Armagnac managed to seize power and turned back the clock on Louis of Guyenne's work to make peace between the factions. The persecution of Burgundians was ramped up, and the streets of Paris were patrolled by army units. The Armagnac party as a whole became centered around the Count, as many other prominent Armagnacs had been killed or captured at Agincourt. Further securing the Armagnac hold on Paris was the presence of the new Dauphin, Charles, in the Armagnac camp. The new crown prince had been staying with his mother when his older brother died, and soon after, the Count of Armagnac moved against the queen. He marched to her castle with one of his army units and seized the Dauphin and her stores of cash, and imprisoned her in Tours. These years, from 1417 on, marked some of the most vicious of the Civil War. John the Fearless encouraged plots to stir up pro-Burgundian riots in Paris, and launched a military campaign to try and retake the city by force. In late 1418, one of those plots succeeded, and Burgundian agents opened the gates of Paris for a small Burgundian army. Paris was taken, and the leading Armagnacs were arrested. The Armagnac knight, Tanguy du Châtel, spirited the Dauphin out of the capital, preventing John the Fearless from taking control of the crown prince. But once again, the Burgundians did gain control of the person of the king. In the aftermath of the Burgundian seizure of the city, an Armagnac army tried to retake it. This attempt failed, but it sparked a bloody riot. The Count of Armagnac himself and many other prominent Armagnacs were killed by paranoid and vengeful Parisians. So while John the Fearless controlled Paris and the king, the Dauphin eluded him. The prince remained under the influence of vengeful Armagnacs and now claimed to be regent of France, as his father was both mad and under the influence of the Duke of Burgundy. Both sides set up rival governments, as both claimed to be the true representative of the Mad King. There was also another aspect to the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War now, the possibility of English intervention. Both sides had tried to secure English aid in the earlier phases of the war, and both had succeeded on occasion. But now the English were impossible to ignore. Henry V's invasion of Normandy was going smoothly, at least for the English, and he was steadily gaining land in France. All three factions were in negotiations with each other as they struggled to decide which of the others they hated the most. These peace conferences always tended to go the same way. Essentially, no one was willing to compromise. Henry V wanted his conquest recognized and ceded in full to England, something which neither French party was willing to give him. While on the French side, John the Fearless wanted unimpeded access to the king and Dauphin, as he was confident that he could influence the Dauphin and get him to join the Burgundian side. And the Armagnacs could not let that happen. So I won't bore you with all the various rounds of negotiations that happened between 1416 and 1419, because we really just need to focus on one. Spurred on by English success in France, moderates in both camps pressured the Armagnacs and the Burgundians to take peace talks with each other more seriously. So in July of 1419, a series of meetings between the Armagnacs and Burgundians resulted in the Treaty of Pouilly. This treaty was little more than a declaration of friendship between the Dauphin and the Duke of Burgundy, but it did contain two important declarations: that Charles and John agree to govern France jointly, and that they make plans for a joint attack on the English. The terms of the treaty were purposefully vague, as more specific terms could have interfered with the negotiations. Much of France rejoiced at the news of the Treaty of Pouilly, as this had been the closest that the Armagnacs and the Burgundians had gotten to making peace in about a decade. But now that a treaty had been made, it needed to go into effect. Disagreement soon arose between the sides, as the vagueness of the treaty now became its own issue. Forts, towns, and castles that were supposed to be handed over from one side to the other were not vacated, and no united campaign against the English took place. John the Fearless began to demand that the Dauphin join him and the king for the whole joint governance part of the treaty. But as we saw earlier, the Dauphin's counselors didn't want him falling into the Duke of Burgundy's orbit. But as the months went by and the treaty kept not going into effect, pressure began mounting for a compromise, especially in the Armagnac camp. But this was met with equal and opposite pressure as the ultras moved to repudiate the treaty. These men, such as Tanguy du Châtel and other old Orleanists, nursed old hatreds of the Duke of Burgundy, which had been heightened by years of civil war. To accept the peace meant allowing John the Fearless to remain in power and risking their control of the Dauphin. After all, the Dauphin was only 16 at this time, and even when he grows up, he won't have the strongest personality. So I understand the fear that being surrounded by John the Fearless and other Burgundians would have done much to undo the Dauphin's Armagnac leanings. But to reject the peace came with its own risks. The people of France wanted peace, and if the Armagnac faction unilaterally annulled the Treaty of Pouilly, they risked being abandoned by many of their moderate supporters. So here comes the backup plan. The Dauphin and his counselors decided that they had to kill the Duke of Burgundy. This plan was hatched by some of the most rabid anti-Burgundians in the Dauphin's court, such as Tanguy du Châtel. Not all of the Dauphin's men approved of the plan, such as Robert Le Masson and the Bishop of Valence. In fact, Le Masson is reported to have said, quote, "I'm very much afraid that he's been wickedly advised and that he'll do something today which will be very damaging both to him and his kingdom," said on the day of the assassination. The Duke of Burgundy and the Dauphin arrived at Montereau, a town and castle on the Yonne River held by Armagnacs on September the 10th, 1419. The two then met on a bridge over the Yonne, accompanied by a few men each. An enclosure had been built on the bridge, and when the Duke of Burgundy entered, his side was locked behind him, while the Dauphin's side was left unlocked. John the Fearless kneeled in front of the prince and doffed his cap, but as he began to rise, Tanguy du Châtel swung his axe into the Duke. Shouts of "Kill, kill!" erupted from the Dauphin's men as more ran into the enclosure, and the Burgundians in the bridge were overwhelmed and killed. Louis of Orleans had finally been avenged. One of the killers of John the Fearless, who had been an old servant of Louis, was reported to have yelled, "You cut off my master's hand, I'll cut off yours," as he attacked the Duke of Burgundy. Burgundian soldiers were aroused by the commotion and attempted to join their master on the bridge, but they could not get through the locked door and were being shot at by Armagnac archers holed up in a nearby building. The assassination of the Duke of Burgundy succeeded in preventing the Treaty of Pouilly from coming into effect, but it would give rise to a treaty far more damaging to the Dauphin, the Treaty of Troyes. Enraged at the murder of his father by the Crown Prince of France, the new Duke of Burgundy, Philip, later known as Philip the Good, decided that an alliance with England was preferable to reconciliation with Dauphin Charles. The Treaty of Troyes disinherited Dauphin Charles and named Henry V of England as King Charles VI's heir, and it cited the murder of John the Fearless as the main reason for this disinheritance. The Treaty of Troyes marked the official alliance between England and Burgundy and is a major reason that the Lancastrian phase of the Hundred Years' War was so disastrous for France. Philip the Good would not reconcile with Charles for 16 years, and when he finally did, France's fortunes seemed to turn around. I won't claim that this was the deciding factor in the Hundred Years' War, as I'm sure Ben's presentation on Joan of Arc later today will likely put forward a good argument on her behalf, but it definitely was a major turning point in the war. The murder of John the Fearless closed one book on the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, but oh boy, did it open another. All right, and if you're curious for further reading, I have a list of books that are all very good. I highly recommend John the Fearless by Richard Vaughan and really all of Richard Vaughan's biographies on the Dukes of Burgundy. And all of these are great reads. The Burgundians is kind of more narrative in structure. It's more directed at, I guess, like a less academic audience, but all of these are good. And now I guess I'll open the floor up to questions. Let's see if I... Ooh, okay. What sort of question was King Charles VI before his mental health affected him? It's kind of hard to say. He only ruled personally for 4 years, but we have, I think, pretty good reason to believe that he would have been an effective king. He ruled in a very similarly to his father, Charles V, who is considered to be one of the better kings of France. And for the 4 years that he reigned, he basically kept on the same advisors that his father had. So I think that if he didn't end up falling into his mental health issues, then he would have been a fairly good king, effective, and I think decent. Do you think that if Charles VI had remained a sane and possibly strong king, do you think Henry V would have thought twice about invading France, or was his invasion inevitable? I think that's a very good question because I could really see it going either way. I think the English invasion of France was definitely spurred on by views of French weakness, because in the Civil War leading up to that moment, you see a lot of both sides are courting the English. So there are a few times where English forces kind of intervene and, they can make some money, they can do some raiding, and France is very much weak. I do personally think that he probably would have invaded anyways, because there's a lot of reasons. He invaded France for really domestic reasons. He saw it as a really good way to keep, as a good way to consolidate power in England, because his father had usurped the throne, and so he needed basically a way to unify England under him. I do think the invasion would have happened. I don't think it would have been quite as disastrous, though. All right. Any other questions?
I am so sorry. I did not realize I was backstage. I did have a question for you, though. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail on some of the reforms that were being discussed at the time, and like if you think that what you think it would have taken for those reforms to sort of take hold.
Yeah, so the big ones were basically reducing government spending. John the Fearless basically railed against high salaries being paid to royal officials, as well as subsidies being paid to royal princes. Um, and then not just in monetary terms, but also in land. Grants of land from the royal domain were very common at the time. And so he basically advocated to reducing them as much as possible. And then there were also things like he wanted to bring back a more consultative form of government. The Estates General, which you might know from the French Revolution, they date back to around this time, a little bit before this time. And so he kind of wanted to, he called on them at one point and tried to get them to, work with him and maybe take some more power. So it's a lot of that thing. It's really rooted in the idea of good governance, with capital GG, good governance, and the public good, capital PG. These like big like kind of loose concepts, I would say, because it's kind of hard to assert that these things ever really existed. They're very much rooted in looking at the past through rose-tinted glasses. But all of his reforms are very much looking backwards to this time of like peace and tranquility, and the government was run really well. And now you have all of these corrupt ministers, stealing the king's money and impoverishing him. Yeah.
And do you think that, well, you mentioned the French Revolution. Do you think that if some of these reforms had started to take place at this point, do you think that the history, I know this gets a little bit later, but do you think that the history of the French Revolution might have gone differently?
I mean, that's really hard to say. Like,
Yeah.
this is like over 300 years before that, and so many things happened. Like, I think it's a lot easier to draw a line from the French Revolution to say Louis the 14th than it is, something like this.
Yeah, that's
But there
fair.
were a lot of a lot of things that kind of do root themselves into it. One of the interesting things with the French Revolution is that historians working in the wake of the French Revolution, they tend to view John the Fearless a lot better than Louis of Orleans. So a lot of the information, the writings we have on John the Fearless and Louis of Orleans, which date from like the 1800s, are very much pro-Burgundian because, coming from the French Revolutionary background, they see John's propaganda that, oh yeah, these princes are, they're wasting all this money and they're corrupt and they're evil. You have to like make reforms. They see that as like a good thing, and they don't really interrogate the extent to how much is this propaganda versus how much is this the actual case of the time. So more recent historians have definitely started to push in the other direction. But yeah, I mean, the historians of the French Revolution viewed John the Fearless pretty favorably.
I can imagine that. Yeah, and that makes sense. Um, Ben does have a question, so I'm going to allow him to ask it.
All right.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. I wanted to add to the whole trajectory of sort of towards the French Revolution. It is really interesting comparing to France to England from the Middle Ages all the way up to the French Revolutionary period, because in England you do have this process of princes ceding power to like, I guess, the people, for want of a better term, with England developing its parliamentary system at this time. And then obviously we know in later centuries with the English Civil War, that the sort of almost decentralization of power is like a sort of gradual thing that happens in England. Whereas in France, from this period, we see a huge rise in absolutism.
Oh yeah.
And I think there's definitely a big argument to be had about, oh, this gets into like loads of other arguments that can be had about how England and France go in sort of the opposite direction. What was my point? I can't remember what my point was, but I find comparing the two to be really interesting. And what if England had conquered France and had a dual monarchy between England and France? Might those reforms have been implemented, like, with the help of the Burgundians? Like, we don't know, obviously, but that would be an interesting alternate history. There's a lot of alternate history theories happening in this conference so far, and I kind of love it.
I think one of the interesting things about kind of looking at the political divide between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians is that you really do see the roots of like absolutism in the Armagnac party. They very much coalesced behind, first Louis of Orleans and then the Dauphin eventually. There's this big period in the middle where they're not really doing that, but especially under the Dauphin Charles, they really put forward this idea of, the king's prerogative, whereas John the Fearless is looking at, he's calling on all of these ancient privileges of nobility. And it's very much backwards looking, but in a way that's a bit more proto-democratic. You can view this conflict in a way as like an ideological conflict between absolutism and, I guess, more traditional feudalism. But I personally view it more as power-hungry princes wanting power. But
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And well, not to plug my own presentation, but I would have this whole thing of like with Joan of Arc, like was it people using her for political reasons? Was it people who were genuinely religiously devout? That's more on the religious side of things. But I think that's all of history is just people always coming at various issues with vested interests. You'll very rarely see like an ideologically pure person in history, especially not one that's been raised to rule and to maintain their power from the day that they're born in this period.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, new comment in the chat. I find it interesting that Edward IV followed a pro-Burgundian foreign policy through a marriage between his sister Margaret to keep France on edge. Oh yeah. There was going forward a little bit. I think in Edward IV, we consider the 100 Years' War to be over at that point, but it was never really ended. I don't think it was actually officially ended until like under the Tudors, maybe. But so there was this brief idea of invading France again. This was really chugged along by Charles the Bold. And he was very anti-France. But yeah, you have these kind of traditional alliances, and they continue to bear fruit even after the Valois dukes are dead. For example, really until the English Reformation, you have the Habsburgs and England being quite close. Between Henry VIII's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who was the aunt of the Habsburg Charles V. Charles V is, through his grandmother, Mary of Burgundy, the heir to the Valois Dukes of Burgundy. So, the link between Burgundy and England is a very deep one. And it has its roots even before the Valois Dukes took power. For example, they took control of Flanders, and the Counts of Flanders and the Kings of England were allied for a very long time. It was this whole thing. You can go back to like the 1100s to look for the Kings of England and the Counts of Flanders working together on like anti-French royal policy.
Well, thank you all for coming. And Josh, thank you for this presentation. I found it absolutely fascinating. I didn't know anything about this, so that was great. And yeah, I could definitely see the different spins and takes that you could do. And I think that is just great. That's a testament to a really well done presentation. So
thanks. And thank you everyone for coming.
Great. Well, we'll see you in some other sessions then.
All right.
All right.
Bye, everyone.